All right, guys. Well, welcome to the next TBL day here. This time we're starting the digestive system, so getting into the early part of the anatomy of the digestive system, as well as the function of that upper portion of the digestive system as well. So looking at the mouth all the way down to the esophagus. So just some overall general ideas about the GI tract. First of all, it's one long tube, everything from the esophagus down to the anus. It's just one continuous tube. Very similar layers and membranes throughout this whole tube. Again, as I mentioned before, we consider it outside of the body. Okay, anything that gets into the digestive tract is considered outside the body. How long is it? 30 feet total. If we add it all up, about 30 feet. But the amazing part actually is the surface area. Okay, so we're going to talk about villi and microvilli, which are little finger-like projections sticking off the tracts like this, all along the lining, especially in the small intestine. We have villi, and then on top of each of these we have microvilli. Because of that, we create a ton of surface area in the digestive tract, which is absolutely crucial to allow for all the little enzymes in the small intestine especially to interact with the food. We have more space for that if we have more surface area. And so how much surface area? It's the size of a football field. We said the lungs were the size of a tennis court. GI tract, in the size of a football field, is how much surface area. Very, very huge. And so obviously this is our system to bring nutrients into the body. Okay? And so why do we need so much surface area? Well, and why do we need to? Well, we need so much surface area, so I already explained that one. But why we need to bring nutrients into the body? Obviously, bringing in nutrients that help us make energy, make ATP. Right, that would be carbohydrates, lipids, and proteins. Okay, but then all of the structures made in the body are made out of the things that we eat in one way or another. Right, so structure and function of all of those, and really all cellular processes are driven by what we put in our GI tract. Okay, so the overall processes of digestion include ingestion, mechanical digestion, and chemical digestion. Okay, so ingestion is really get food into the body. All right, so that could be eating, that could be tubes that they might put in you in the hospital, nasogastric or stomach tubes. And then there's mechanical digestion. Okay, the second process, that is actually physically smashing food, breaking it apart, which helps mix it up. So we do this by chewing, mixing by the tongue, churning by the stomach, segmentation by the different parts of the intestinal tract, which we'll talk about in a second. Chemical digestion is really using enzymes to break down food particles into smaller particles so we can prepare for absorption. Okay, and some of those enzymes are listed. And so some of those enzymes are listed here. We have lipases, which help us digest lipids, zymogens, which are proteolytic enzymes, so those help us break down protein. All right, and those are the inactivated forms of the zymogens. And then we have amylases, which are helpful for carbohydrates. So those are the three main processes: ingestion, mechanical digestion, and chemical digestion. And then we have a few more processes that have to do with movement of food mostly, and as well as some others. So propulsion is a function of this, is just moving food through the digestive tract. And there's two subcategories of this. One would be deglutition, which is swallowing. Okay, and then peristalsis, which is smooth muscle contraction and waves. Okay, and then we also have absorption as a process. Obviously, the last step of the digestive tract, as far as getting stuff into our body, is absorbing it. Okay, so this is moving the food particles from the digestive tract to the blood or the lymph. And then lastly, whatever's left over that we don't need to absorb, we go through defecation, and that's elimination of the undigested or indigestible substances from the GI tract. These two images are nicely show peristalsis and segmentation. Okay, segmentation is the idea that food is getting pushed down one direction by peristalsis, okay, and then all of a sudden it hits a wall here. Okay, this part closes off, comes down, hits the wall, and that causes it to churn back up. Okay, and then it pushes down again, hits another wall here, boom, hits off that and churns back up this way. That causes a lot of mixing, so there's a little bit of mechanical digestion happening there, as well as helping with enzymatic digestion by mixing it up. And peristalsis is really just coordinated contractions, pushing the food down in waves. Okay, yeah, and so like it says there, peristalsis, alternating contractions of longitudinal and circular smooth muscle. Okay, the longitudinal is the stuff here on the outside. Circular is going right around the middle, kind of like little circles wrapping around the middle. Okay, this is the segmentation is really just using that circular muscle only. That's what allows us to pinch off certain spots and create those little walls. Okay, where in the GI tract does each process take place? So I want you to think about that, look at this diagram here, and then just write in the different parts of the GI tract. Okay, so we're talking about the mouth, right, the stomach, small intestine, other parts of the mouth over here, oropharynx, and down into the throat. Sorry about that. And then small intestine, large intestine, stomach, esophagus. Those are pretty much your options. Okay, so kind of fill those in on your own as a little bit of a recap. Okay, so let's talk about the layers of the overall GI tract. And it has multiple layers. So the first one is called the mucosa layer. This is the most inner part. Okay, this is simple columnar epithelial tissue. We've looked at this before when we talked about epithelial tissue. This is what contains goblet cells. We talked about these, right? The functions of those goblet cells are here. They are going to release the mucus, right? And then that mucus is going to help us dissolve digestive products, as well as protect the GI tract from some of the dangerous chemicals and other things that can come through. And so by dissolving digestive products, that means activating enzymes, turning them in from inactive proteins into active enzymes. And then we also have our enteroendocrine cells in this mucosa layer. These are really single cells that release hormones. And we're going to talk about what a lot of those hormones do later. Okay. Next, we have the lamina propria. Okay, which is so still part of the mucosa. But so we have the mucosa, the simple columnar epithelium first. Next, lamina propria. This is connective tissue with capillaries. Okay, this is the capillaries that absorb the nutrients, transport hormones. Next, we have the muscularis mucosa. This is a thin, smooth muscle layer that isn't the stuff that does peristalsis and segmentation, but it is the muscle that just moves a little bit to help us dislodge food stuck in that little inner layer. Okay. Secondly, the submucosa, next layer out. So this is dense, irregular connective tissue. Okay, we talked about that kind of connective tissue before. So now we're moving away from where the food goes through, going further exterior. Okay, this is mainly elastic fibers. Function of that is GI tract's gonna get stretched, and those elastic fibers allow it to bounce back and maintain shape after it's stretched. Okay, so it contains blood vessels, lymph vessels, and nerves. Okay, why blood vessels? So we can absorb those digestive products. Okay, why lymph vessels? Because that helps us bring in lipids. We're going to talk about that in a second. And then why nerves? Because that's going to help us contract that smooth muscle. And then what kind of nerves is it? It's going to be autonomic neurons. Okay, and then we have the muscularis externa layer. It's the next one after the submucosa. This is mostly all smooth muscle. And there's two layers in most of it. The inner layer is circular fibers like we just looked at. Outer layer is longitudinal. Okay, and then if we get into the stomach, there's a third layer called the oblique layer, because the stomach really can move a lot, and it needs that third layer to do that. Okay, and then we have sphincters as well, which will block areas. Okay, so this can completely close the GI tract to prevent backflow and to slow movement. So those are just really the same idea, thickenings of those smooth muscle layers that can completely close it off. Okay, and then we have the serosa. This is the most external layer in the GI tract. This is the serous membranes. Okay, just like we talked about around the lungs, around the heart, this is the one around the GI tract. Okay, so we have simple squamous epithelium, that's the mesothelium part, and then we have the areolar connective tissue. And again, we have a visceral layer and a parietal layer. So this is called peritoneum instead of the pleural membranes like in the lungs we were just talking about. Instead, we have the visceral peritoneum and the parietal peritoneum. So the functions of this are to protect the whole GI tract and to cut down on friction. And then the next region is called the mesentery. Okay, and the mesentery is the double folded layer of the peritoneum. And you guys saw this in the cats. That kind of fatty tissue holds organs in place, creates a pathway for nerves and blood vessels to be held in. Okay, and here's pretty much what we have with all of those different layers. I'm not going to uncover these, but you can go to figure 22.3 in your book, and you can label these, and I would recommend labeling these very closely so you're ready for the quiz when you take it. Okay, so the digestive tract has a few special features to it. One of those features is the way that it gets blood. Okay, so first of all, we have the splanchnic circulation. That's the blood supply to the digestive tract. Between meals, this takes about 25% of our cardiac output, so about a quarter of our blood goes here. So it takes a lot of blood. It's a lot of blood heading this direction normally. Okay, so this obviously feeds the cells of the GI tract as well as helps us absorb nutrients. Secondly, we have another portal circulation. This is the hepatic portal. So that's the liver. Anytime you see hepatic, that means liver. Okay, so this is the blood flow to the liver. Remember, anytime we have the portal circulation, that's a unique situation where we have two capillary beds. So it goes vein to capillary, back to vein, and then back to the heart. Okay? That's different than our normal situation where it goes artery, capillary, vein, and then heart. All right, so this went artery first. We just had another vein in there, the extra vein. Yeah, so then we even have another, and so in this case, we went from, there's another capillary bed here as well, excuse me. Capillary bed right there as well. So it went from artery to capillary bed to vein, vein to another capillary bed, then to a vein, and then to the heart. That's the difference with the portal circulation. So we see that right here. Here is the first capillary bed all around the digestive tract. That's where nutrients are absorbed. Then it goes into the big portal vein. All of those nutrient molecules that were just absorbed goes into the big portal vein. That portal vein then dumps into the liver up here. Okay, so that liver monitors the contents of the blood, but then it has to, in able to do that, it has to go into capillary bed. So this is that second capillary bed in the liver. So that's the portal circulation. Okay, and then another unique feature is the nervous system in the digestive tract, and it's called the enteric nervous system. It's controlled by the central nervous system, similar to the parasympathetic nervous system. And it coordinates all activity in the GI tract, and that makes sure food is moving at the same pace throughout. So imagine all of the unique control that's required to make those peristaltic contractions happen nice and smoothly, all in the right order. It's very, very complex. You don't need to know the names of this stuff over here. Just need to know in general that's the nervous system for the GI tract. Okay, so let's start looking at the actual structures starting in the mouth all the way down. Okay, so we'll start with the oral cavity. Oral cavity obviously is the mouth. Okay, you can go ahead and label each of the structures on the diagram here using the structures over here. So lips, tongue, obviously the tongue is controlled by two different types of muscles. The extrinsic muscles, which move the tongue, and they originate on the skull. That's why they're extrinsic. Okay, and then intrinsic muscles within the tongue. They originate within the tongue, and they can just change the shape of the tongue. We've talked about those before a little bit with the cranial nerves. And then lastly, the gustatory receptors or taste buds. Okay, we have the soft and hard palate, and then we have the pharynx. Okay, so go ahead and label those structures. Make sure you're familiar with where everything's at. Okay, some other unique features in the mouth that we haven't talked about before, besides just talking about which nerves innervate them, are the salivary glands. Okay, so inside of our salivary glands, they're typically made up of two different types of cells that represent the different parts of the nervous system that control each of them. So first of all, we have the serous cells. The serous cells produce a watery secretion that includes enzymes. And then secondly, we have the mucus cells, which produce thick, stringy mucus. Okay, there's continuous secretions. We secrete a lot of saliva every day. It's from around 1 liter to 1.5 liters every day. Parasympathetic activation will cause the serous cells to activate. Okay, that makes sense. Parasympathetic has to do with digestion, right? So that's the one that includes the enzymes, is the one that's going to be PNS driven. And then secondly, sympathetic activation with that thick mucus secretion is going to activate those mucus cells only, and that'll help us decrease fluid loss when we're under stress. Okay, so definitely want to remember that difference there between the two types of cells and which parts of the nervous system innervate them. Okay, so a little bit about the teeth. I don't know if there's any of you this semester in the class that are going to dental school, but there's usually one or two, and you'll get a lot more information on that, obviously, in dental school than this 2 slides. But the main thing about the tooth that you need to know here is the 3 parts to it, the crown, the neck, and the root. Okay, and then we also have what are called periodontal ligaments that hold the teeth to the bones themselves, the maxilla or the mandible, depending on whether it's the top or the bottom. Okay, and then so there's different layers of the teeth as well. The outer layer is the enamel. Okay, the inner bone-like portion is called the dentin, and then the very center of the teeth is called the pulp. This is connective tissue that includes vessels and nerves. Okay, and then between the teeth and the ligaments is something called a structure, or a substance called cementum, which really just literally cements the teeth into place. Okay, so again, you can use your book, Figure 22.6, to label these structures that I have that I have here, and make sure you're prepared to label those. Okay, so let's work our way down out of the mouth now into the esophagus. Esophagus is connecting the laryngopharynx to the stomach. Okay, so really it goes nasal cavity on top, oral cavity down to the larynx, and then down to the pharynx, and then the pharynx is split up into the nasopharynx, oropharynx, laryngopharynx. That's the last part before it turns into the esophagus. Okay, so the esophagus is completely collapsed when empty. Okay, we don't need it to be open like we do the trachea, so it can collapse when it's empty, and that gives more room for our trachea to be open for air. So it has the muscularis layer, has a kind of 3 different portions to it. The part closest to the mouth, the upper 1/3, is all striated muscle that we can voluntarily control. Okay, the middle 1/3 is half and half, about half the striated, half smooth muscle, and then the lower 1/3 is all smooth muscle, so that's going to be involuntary. Okay, so once we get down into that lower 1/3, it's all involuntary. The rest of the whole GI tract is mostly involuntary. Okay, and that's just what it means, is about which part we can control, which part we can't. Okay, so the one thing to think about that I mentioned before about the diaphragm is that the hole, it has a couple holes in it, and so the esophageal hiatus is the hole that the esophagus goes through in the diaphragm, and that allows the esophagus to pass through. Okay, one clinical application of that is something we call a hiatal hernia. This is when the stomach actually pushes up through that hole and makes its way superior to the diaphragm. Okay, so if we look at this over here, this image of a hiatal hernia, we have stomach down here, obviously, esophagus up here. This right here is a spot that's supposed to be aligning with the diaphragm, which is right here. This is diaphragm. Okay, that's the hole that it goes through right here. Okay, but instead that the stomach is shifted up And now we have part of our stomach actually superior to our diaphragm. And that creates some problems because normally that diaphragm actually helps squeeze down on this part right here, which is helpful for keeping food from going back from the stomach into the esophagus. And so it helps what's called the gastroesophageal sphincter, also known as a cardiac sphincter. It helps it do its job in keeping that stomach acid out of the esophagus. Okay, yeah, sorry. And then yeah, so this prevents backflow. Okay, so this hiatal hernia will definitely lead to gastroesophageal reflux disease, also known as GERD. Okay, so let's talk about the steps of digestion from the mouth to the esophagus. And then and so we'll first start with what happens in the mouth. Excuse me. So in the mouth, we have two different types of digestion that occur. We have mechanical digestion. That's pretty easy to think about why. That's because we have our teeth smashing that food down, our tongue even smashing the food towards the roof of the mouth. That's mechanical digestion with the chewing and the moving around with the tongue. Okay. Secondly, we have a little bit of chemical digestion that happens, but only to one of our macronutrients. So when our parasympathetic nervous system activates those salivary glands, that activates the serous cells only, and inside of that mucus release from the serous cells is salivary amylase. Okay, when we see this word amylase, that makes us think carbohydrates. Okay, so we get partially breakdown carbohydrates. Okay, so if you take something that you know is just complex carbohydrates, like bread or a cracker that doesn't have any sugar on it, or something like that, and you chew it up a little bit and then just let it sit in your mouth, what happens to the taste? It becomes sweet. All right, because we start to break down those polysaccharides, or those long chains of monosaccharides, into disaccharides. And disaccharides are sugars, and they taste sweet. Okay, so we have a little bit of chemical digestion happening here, but really only for carbohydrates. Okay, so now the main process from this section of notes is swallowing, also known as deglutition. Okay, so we're going to go through these steps here over the next few slides, and this will pretty much wrap us up. So there's kind of three main phases to it: the voluntary phase, the pharyngeal phase, and the esophageal phase. Okay, so the food, in the voluntary phase, the food's formed into a bolus or a ball. Okay, we use that word bolus, carries on throughout the rest of the GI tract, and then that's pushed into the pharynx by the tongue. Okay, that's all voluntary. Our tongue is voluntarily controlled. Our mouth is as well. Secondly, the pharyngeal phase, and once it gets into the throat, there's a few complex things that happen to make sure food goes down the right tube. All right, so we have our nasopharynx blocked off by the soft palate moving up. Okay, we don't want the food going up. We want it going down. So the nasopharynx gets blocked off by that soft palate. Next, we have the trachea blocked off by the larynx. By the larynx lifting up and the epiglottis tipping down to close the glottis. Okay, and then we also have pharyngeal muscle contraction, which pushes that bolus down into the esophagus. Okay, then once we get into the esophagus, we have we need the upper esophageal sphincter to open. Upper esophageal sphincter to open to allow that food into the esophagus first. So that's the first step. Then we have peristaltic contractions that move that bolus down towards the stomach. Okay, and then lastly, the gastroesophageal sphincter opens and then allows the food to enter the stomach. Okay, so those are kind of all the main steps. So what I want you to think about here and do is look at these different phases of deglutition. Use this figure in your book. Figure 29 or 22:9, and fill in what's happening here. Okay, we got the phase in first phase in the mouth, second phase in the pharynx, right? Third phase down in the esophagus. Okay, so fill in what's happening there. This one got a little bit messed up in the esophageal phase. You can see what's hidden underneath there. The thing got moved. So okay, and then once it gets into the esophagus, then we have steps 4 and 5. You can see what's happening, the different smooth muscle contraction, sending the food down towards the stomach, and then getting to the part where the gastroesophageal sphincter is, which will be right here. Right, that has to open for this food to get down into the stomach. Okay, so go to that figure in your book, fill in what's going on here to help prepare for the IRAT and TRAT next week. Okay, so just a few questions for you to think about for each slide. Okay, so outline the steps on the previous slide, making sure to incorporate the following. Okay, where is the bolus with each step? What action is actually moving the bolus? What other actions are being taken to making sure the bolus goes in the right direction? Right, so that would mean like which things are blocked, which things are opened, things like that. And then which muscles, okay, which muscles as far as, is this voluntary or involuntary? And then, and then which muscles? So which muscles meaning, is it the tongue muscles? Is it the pharynx? Is it the epiglottis moving? All right, so some of those things, the esophagus. Okay, so do that with each step. And then we talked about 2 sphincters. All right, so when is each sphincter open and closed? Those are things you want to know to prepare for the TBL day next week. All right, thanks a lot, guys. We'll see you soon.